Species unite.
There was a farmer who I met had the craziest, but not crazy because it's happening everywhere. A hog horn rammed into him. He got a disease. No one had any idea what it was. He went septic. He almost died. And he figured out that his herd had gotten an antibiotic resistant bug because of the way he was farming.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. We have a favor to ask. If you like today's episode and you have a spare minute, could you please rate and review Species Unite on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts? It really helps people to find the show. This conversation is with Chloe Sorvino. Chloe leads coverage of food and agriculture at Forbes. She writes the newsletter Mind Feeder and founded the Forbes newsletter Fresh Take. She is also the author of Raw Deal, Hidden Corruption, Corporate Greed, and the Fight for the Future of Meat. Everyone should read this book. It's deep dive reporting into the power and corruption of the meat industry and how that affects how and what Americans eat. Chloe, hi. Thank you for being here. This is awesome.
Oh, it's awesome to be here. Thanks.
I have a lot of questions. I want to talk about your book. Your book came out a couple years ago. Mostly it's about how we got where we are with big ag and the meat industry. And I thought I knew really I think everybody has this vague notion of like, it's really bad. It's really scary. Our food system's not sustainable. Everything's going to fall apart. We watched it fall apart during COVID. But then it all got kind of band-aided back together again. And I don't think most people think, as long as food is in the grocery store, they're not really stressed about it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's kind of why I really wanted to write this in the first place. I feel like people were so mad in 2020 in the pandemic when plants were closing and they had no meat on shelves. But there really wasn't the actual information to share, like why their anger was, very valid to begin with. And on top of that, I feel like no one really had the actual information or understanding to really be able to say like why the status quo is not changing. And That's kind of really what I wanted to kind of get across. Again, framed also around climate and how we don't have enough time to waste. And at this point, the solutions that are going to save us in the long term and all the future generations, really, the kinks need to be worked out right now before it's too late.
Before we get into it, like how did this become your world, writing about this stuff and diving so deep into our food system?
I've always been a voracious eater, and I've been at Forbes for a decade. And I toured my first beef slaughterhouse in 2016. I drew from all of those years for this book. I mean, I had started out at Forbes doing the valuations on our list for the billionaires. You see, there's a lot of work that goes into those back end numbers. And I pretty much got a really amazing crash course in understanding just how much power is in the meat industry and how that wealth was made. And it's from a lot of equity, holding on to it and growing it over time.
And that's a big part of how we got here. Will you talk about like how this happened and how so few companies own everything?
In 2020, when all of a sudden slaughterhouses were closing and people were suddenly asking why, it's because there's been this massive amount of consolidation in the meat industry in just the past, 50 years or so. It's really happened super quickly and it's accelerated a lot, in just the past 15 years, 10 years, and also even since the pandemic. So it's actually even continued to get worse. But it all started really because of a bunch of different dynamics that I go into in the book. But really, the meat packers, these billionaire-owned slaughterhouses, the Tysons of the world, Cargill, even smaller ones like Joe Grendy's Cook Foods, a really big chicken processor, and a lot of others, the Purdue family, they all had to kind of push out of the cities, get closer to the corn where that was that's the big expense, right? For food, for animals, for livestock, you have to feed them the feed. And so as slaughterhouses moved out of the cities closer towards where the grain was being made, these slaughterhouses got way bigger, and they essentially got more consolidated.
And so talk about why, like this whole consolidation, these very few people, very few companies, why is this so bad?
A number of reasons. First and foremost, I think we have to talk about the climate when you talk about why it is so bad, right? Because these are now only a select few players that have pretty much all the power and have the ability to actually change if they want to, but they haven't. And not only have they not, but they've been putting money towards lobbying for regulations that are better for them. And they've also been putting money in all their kind of waste from they've been polluting. There've been even several lawsuits that I talk about in the book and more recently that really go into how the communities around production, the soil, the land use, all of it has been really destroyed from how meat is made. And that's not just how the slaughterhouses do it. It's also how feedlots feed and fatten up animals so quickly and in a really kind of inhumane, in a way that kind of is very not normal to their natural tendencies. And so, aside from the soils, there's different parts of the book I talk about, in the hog industry, for example, with manure lagoons and how there's just so much excess that comes from such a massive amount of hogs physically in one space, right? Because there's only now, a few handful of these massive plants, right? So when you have only a few, then you have tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of animals in one location. And that creates a lot of, I don't know if I can curse on this, but shit.
For people who don't get it, like what's a waste lagoon?
When you have all of those animals, like tens of thousands of animals living in one confined area, they're constantly going to the bathroom, and that manure is going down through the slats of these buildings and into these kind of slurry streams that are built underneath these buildings. They're all going into these like lagoons or kind of pools that usually sit on, very close by to these kind of main slaughterhouses and where the animals are kept.
And you can see these sometimes like when you're flying over.
Yes.
And
They're
it looks
very
like giant,
smelly.
like disgusting, like Olympic pools of shit.
Huge, yes, yeah, football field size, massive pools of shit. But they're also really dangerous. I've seen them myself. There have been several families of farmers who have all died from just the different odors and the smells, and then getting kind of pulled in and having other people trying to save them, and then they died too.
They've died from falling in?
Yeah, because the smells are so noxious often. It's poisonous. And so people have fallen in. There's, a few brothers, a few different families that have all perished because they tried to save the first person who fell in. But, it's not even just like stories like that. There's real discrimination and environmental discrimination to really consider here. The NAACP has filed lawsuits about how the neighbors often around these places, particularly in states like North Carolina, where there's a lot of these hog facilities, they've gotten asthma, they've gotten chronic illnesses, they've had miscarriages, birth defects, very serious stuff. And it's typically because, the lagoons are then sprayed out as manure and it gets into the air. It's really impacted quality of life in these areas, let alone life expectancy.
It's environmentally horrific. Things. It's terrible for anyone who lives anywhere near there.
Correct.
And it's like giving people diseases and killing them. There's so many lawsuits against these guys, not just for this, kind of for everything.
Absolutely. Environment's just the first way, really, right? Because when you have only a few select players, you get a lot of incentives to do things that maybe you wouldn't do otherwise. There have been countless allegations of conspiracy for different types of financial manipulation that the book goes into. Particularly, one chapter I have is about the wage manipulation among chicken workers, how executives were meeting at this like annual summit, and it often was be in Florida, and they'd be going on like tiki boat cruises and then discussing this really serious, really problematic financial wage and benefits suppressing that they had been doing for years to essentially keep their number two cost, which is the labor, as low as possible. And then also, the book goes into all of the different price fixing allegations, which had really, for the past decade have taken this industry by storm, especially in the chicken industry, but it's gone so much further beyond that. There are allegations in the pork industry, the beef industry. And again, it's really stemming from only a select few players having way better data access. They can pay for the access. And when you get that sort of information sharing, there's a lot that's been happening. And only now have the Department of Justice and other regulators and AGs of states really been actually, calling it out and trying to rectify it.
Go back for a second to COVID and during the pandemic when everyone kept saying, we can now see these huge holes in our food system, right?
Absolutely.
What happened that happened?
I mean, I think the fragility really was always there.
Yeah.
Because when you get that big, you are going to miss some things. COVID was just an example of what really can continue to happen in the future when a fire breaks out in a plant or a hurricane takes out a few plants. I mean, I think when we have it more extreme weather coming, and Temple has shared this with me, that we haven't fixed those fragility problems, and extreme weather, climate crisis is only going to keep pressuring this system that really has only had Band-Aids put on it. This is a super vulnerable workforce. This is a workforce that has dozens of languages spoken in each of these plants. Most of these workers are people of color. Often they're immigrants, refugees, people who are often getting their first jobs in this country. These plants push the government to stay open at the detriment of workers. When I wrote a story in 2020 about a plant at Foster Farms, and when I wrote the story, they didn't have a single piece of PPE in their plant.
And people were dying.
There was the Tyson betting pool among white collar workers, right? Like the managers of this one plant in Waterloo, Iowa had, they did an actual betting pool. How many workers would die? These people were not being treated with dignity.
And they aren't treated with dignity ever. It wasn't just the pandemic.
Right.
And when plants were being forced to shut down.
Right.
Right. And then so farmers were left, or factory farms were left with mass amounts of animals that were getting too big,
couldn't fit through the lines anymore because these lines are so mechanized down to literally the point of a pound for these animals. And so, when you have them then getting, bigger and growing for another week or two, it actually causes a huge difference.
Well, and one thing in your book that I had never thought of, and I've never heard anyone else talk about, was that not only are you then killing all these animals, but also they have been fed so much for so long of that food waste.
It's an astronomical amount of food waste. And not only was that animal, all that meat was wasted, but it was also the tens of thousands of tons of corn and soy that were farmed monocrop and polluting and, hurting waterways. All of that went into all of that waste.
Right.
All wrapped in together.
So we saw all that, right? And we saw the crying farmer saying we have to kill our pigs now, which, I mean, the pigs are going to be killed anyway. And we saw what happened to the workers, and people got a glimpse of what workers' lives were like.
Absolutely.
And like literally how vulnerable they are. And they're not making any money, and they're making horrible money. And they're working like 14-hour shifts and in really dangerous conditions. Talk about that, something just like worker safety conditions. And like, how is this okay?
I mean, it's not. I mean, that's why I say things like, this industry hides certain aspects of it by design, and that's because they want to protect themselves, their bottom line, their profits. With how the workers in this industry face, it really can't be understated what they face. They're not only some of the most vulnerable and marginalized workers in America, but they go into these environments that are daily, extremely violent oftentimes, right? And not just in terms of the machinery that they can get hurt from and then have significant injuries from, right? So just based on that alone, it's one of the most dangerous jobs. Also, then you take in all the chemicals that are in these plants. There's aspects there, but it's not even that really, there is institutional racism in these plants. There is a lot of harassment. There is sexual harassment and sexual assault. My book goes into all of these different things because it's unfortunately a pattern. It's not just one-off cases or, one-off EEOC complaints.
And no one really has any rights. It's so hard to fight against any of this.
Yeah, I think I think a lot is still about one class action that was alleging a lot of like racial discrimination. One of the 19 claimants was pregnant, and she was told that she couldn't go to the bathroom while working on the line. And I think, just the dignity that these workers deserve and that's been stripped from them is just so not okay. But the other thing I'll say, I think all of this is super underreported, but one of the craziest things I learned that I still am shocked by, workers, they don't really understand that they could work one shift and actually get infected with the superbug that lives in these plants. And while that may sound like kind of crazy, it's happening all the time. Tens of thousands of plant workers are dying from this every year, but it's super underreported because, you know, it could ignite itself right then and there. Or what more often happens is, you know, from just like one shift even, or one summer job, one kind of few months, that superbug can ignite far later, like when they have cancer, or if they have pneumonia, or if they're in the hospital for anything else. And then all of a sudden what they have becomes an antibiotic resistant infection, and it goes south extremely quickly.
Is it because these superbugs are living in these, and because there's so many antibiotics used to begin with?
Yeah, because there's so much overuse of antibiotics that these plants are hotbeds for antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And
and no one's talking about that.
No, I mean, I could have one. I probably do. You know, I've been in so many of them. No, it's serious. When I found that out, right, that it might not manifest for years, decades after, and again, just
it's terrifying. Well, and not to mention bird flu. Bird flu is a disaster. It could be a much bigger disaster.
Well, it's a huge disaster, and it's been for a few years. You know, when my book came out, it was already the worst outbreak in U.S. history of bird flu, but now it's gotten even worse. It's been transferring to humans. It's been transferring to other cattle and cows and dairy cows. And the strain that's actually can get into humans actually is like 50% deadly. I mean, this is no joke. And I think it's another perfect example of how concentration, having only a few plants with tens of thousands of animals in them, can create something like this so quickly. These zoonotic diseases, we're only kind of unfortunately poised to have more coming because of how we raise these animals.
It's being mentioned. There's an article every week or so that you'll see. There's definitely nothing mentioned that really scares people, right? In your world, are people talking about it more seriously?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people in my world are terrified.
Yeah.
And they think this is also just what's more to come. Yeah. More frequent of this, more extreme examples of this.
Well, a lot more pandemics. But this particular pandemic.
Yeah, no, it's fairly serious. Again, it's the death rate in humans of one of the two strains that are kind of gaining traction right now I think it's a 50% death rate, says the CDC.
And COVID was like 1.4. And has any of that changed since the pandemic, since there was like a tiny bit of light shown on it?
Honestly, what I'll say is it's unfortunately, in terms of antibiotics, it's gotten worse.
Right.
Tyson's gone back on its antibiotic-free policy. 6 years ago when they said they were officially taking antibiotics out of their chicken supply chain, they did it because they said they didn't want to have, any part in an antibiotic-resistant disease spreading and, a public health crisis from that.
Well, and for people who don't know, 70% of antibiotics used in the world are used in factory farms, are used in the U.S. Is it U.S.?
Yes. And other countries, just being international for a second, other countries have brought in this level so much lower. I mean, they say that they can't here, but that's just simply not true. It's been proven other places. And so Tyson going back on, now putting antibiotics back in their, feed and just using it for growth promotion,
So they're not even using it so much to prevent disease as they are for growth.
No, yeah. I mean, they're using it for growth. So now they went back, they're using, they said they won't be using anything that's usually used for humans. I think time will tell. Right now they say it's, not medically important for humans, but even that though, I've talked to the experts, even that causes resistance, causes co-resistance, and creates more antibiotic resistance.
Already people around the world are dying from superbugs.
Absolutely. I literally did a book event a few days ago, and there was a farmer who I met had the craziest, but not crazy because it's happening everywhere. A hog horn rammed into him. He got a disease. No one had any idea what it was. He went septic. He almost died. He was preparing to die, and he figured out that his herd had gotten an antibiotic-resistant bug because of the way he was farming.
And the truth is, the more of this we do, and we're like, global meat consumption is supposed to double in the next 20 years.
It's only getting worse. And the more we use them right now, the less we're going to be able to use them in the future.
And so they're not going to work for humans. So it's going to be like one of our number one killers at some point in the near future.
It's going to be another pandemic. And that's why, again, all of this is wrapped up in how these Band-Aids are causing more problems because these are hidden, right?
And they're allowed to remain hidden.
Yeah. And that's by also, from the regulators and the way all this works.
And part of it, though, is government wants big meat to win. There's a big connection that if we don't have meat in the grocery store, people don't vote. Like, it affects voting.
People get very angry in America when there's no meat or when their meat's more expensive. There's definitely crazy history showing that time and time again over just, the past 100 years in America. And what the USDA, chief says is, we get it. We know that's a problem, but all we really care about, I'm paraphrasing, but all we really care about is being able to buy the cheapest meat possible because that's what taxpayers need. And so, when you don't see, accountability happening on that end because they're actually saying it's because of price,
right? That's
all you need to know.
Meanwhile, even though it looked like everything was in such chaos, especially during the pandemic with all these guys, they made a lot of money.
They had profits like they've never seen. And now, it started to roll back a bit because you can't have unprecedented profit making for that long. But especially in these industries where there's been a lot of allegations of price fixing, I mean, there was years and years of unprecedented profits.
How do you see any of this changing? And before we even go into other foods, alternative protein, within the actual meat
reason
industry.
I set this book up this way, coming from the power dynamics behind this industry, is because if we want the status quo to change, we have to understand why things haven't yet. And unfortunately, I think at this point, I don't think the billionaires are out to save us, or I don't think they're out to change willingly, right? I don't think we've seen only the opposite. Tyson going back on using antibiotics is another key one. And so because of that, sure, I think there has to be kind of consumer demand, consumer market changes that hopefully push the needle a little bit. But I think also coming to this book, through this book and through this process, I realized that unfortunately, this kind of concept of voting with your dollars can be a bit of a false messiah, because I'm not sure that your dollar or my dollar has the same power at the end of the day as a dollar from one of these billionaires or how this system is set up, right? And especially when you go to a grocery store, when there's so many different layers to get that actual dollar back to the farmer or back to the players who are actually making a difference, you see it's really tough. And so I would love to see a way to have this change. And I think it can, but I think it has to really come from collective action and communities building it regionally, step by step. And that is way harder than, that's the actual work, right?
No, it's insanely hard because it's most people, if you're a mom with 4 kids and they eat meat and you're busy and you're working and you're trying to take care of everything, you go buy the cheapest thing and you don't really think too much about it. And you don't feel like it's your responsibility to take collective action on a really shitty industry.
Totally. Yeah. And the convenience is huge. That's where they get you, right? And I would love for more people to use their CSAs, right? Or food hubs or different types of buying that isn't, I'm not even talking about farmers markets. I think those can be a little controversial, but it's going to take a lot of work and honestly more disruption to get where I think it needs to be, which is for the moms who are buying for their families, just trying to find healthy, accessible, clean meat or protein to serve their
and this is like the thing that has always baffled me. But there's not, yes, it's convenient and it's habit and it's conditioning and all of those things because it's not healthy.
It's not. It's so much worse for you.
It's destroying the planet. So you're not going to give your kids a good planet. It's an inherently cruel food system. And you're not going to have healthy children growing up on this crappy food. And we know this, right?
Yeah, we know it.
And the moms know this, but it's still so ingrained. And that is what they play on.
Right, absolutely. And just to your point too, the nutrition level of these types of meats are completely different when they're pasture raised or even just fed grass and grass fed compared to, factory farm chicken or pork or beef that are, force fed things that are not natural to their bodies.
Right. Because the pandemic did shine a light on all that. For a minute, people paid attention. I guess bird flu, if it really started jumping, it's in the milk. Right?
It is in the milk. People. I saw a headline the other day that people are. You shouldn't do this, but drinking raw milk because they think it'll protect them from it. And that's exactly the opposite. You're not supposed to have any raw milk now.
That's scary.
Yeah. No, it's because, again, for the human strain, this is the most dangerous one yet for humans.
And they're not testing at most factory farms. Like, they're not testing their cows.
No.
Even though they know it's in the cows. Like, so we're doing the same that we did in COVID. And so, like, there were no lessons learned in that sense, right?
No, people just went back to saying, okay, the farm down the street was too expensive. Now I'm going to go back to the Kroger a few minutes away that has way cheaper chicken.
Right. It's scary.
That's why I think it just can't come from the consumer demand aspect. Again, because of these power dynamics and because of just how those shift, like how much our actual dollars like really mean and how meaningful that really is in like a business and financial sense. But I mean, I don't think it's all for loss, right? I think we can get to a place where the regional food system is way better supported. That has to come through like infrastructure, particularly.
But that really needs government.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's where the government should be stepping in.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about, because I'm a huge fan of alternative protein, and I'm a huge, huge fan of cultivated meat, even though I know we have a long way to go. Well, let's start with alternative proteins.
Yeah.
You really like meaty in the book, at least. Do you still?
Well, I do. I think, again,
Wait, before you tell me, tell them what meaty is.
Yeah. So meaty is one of these mycelium, the root of fungi-based alternative protein startups. And I really appreciate how the founder, Tyler Huggins, has really built this. He's a philosophy, doctorate. He also grew up on a bison ranch. And I really have appreciated how they have not just tried to grow at all costs, but at the same time, obviously, they have to kind of keep this business. They went through a few layoffs since the book came out, but they also just raised $100 million. So they're surviving. I think it's been a little touch and go, but what I really appreciate about them, what I wrote about them, and why I like them in the book is because of how they source and how he's been really, really thoughtful. Like, none of these other alternative protein companies have really thought about the actual ingredients enough, in my opinion, as a journalist. Beyond impossible, they've been really, sourcing from as cheap as possible the monoculture farmed ingredients like soy, right, and pea protein for Beyond. That I think is also a main part of the meat problem. And so
so like, how can we do this completely differently and not copy the meat industry without animals?
Right. And so Meaty and a few other of these mycelium, fungi-based startups have been trying to do that differently, and I applaud them for that. Obviously, everything needs to be fed, though, and so mycelium still needs feed, and like what the feedstock is really important. The reason I appreciated Meaty so much is because they're the only ones I could find that were sourcing regenerative energy. Essentially, they were doing regeneratively sourced sugarcane to kind of fund the to kind of push and fuel the fermentation process of their main protein. And so, you also can't do stuff like that that's like visionary without actually having real business behind it, right? Yeah. And so, as they continue to scale, I hope that they continue to do that and continue to think about that long term, and not just with their sugarcane, but with all the other kind of inputs, because there's a lot that goes into these companies, because again, they're now sourcing all these different ingredients, like doing some fun flavor science around it, packaging it into something that we're familiar with, and then
it's biodegradable too, right? The packaging,
right? Yes, yeah. And then it's also kind of hit all these kind of consumer test points. So there's a lot that has to go into it,
right? But it's cool.
Yeah,
I mean, there's some really exciting. I think all the mycelium stuff is pretty exciting.
Yeah, definitely. And I know Tyler's told me that they think of media as a kind of a canary in the coal mine. Yeah. I think this is past funding round. I think they're feeling pretty solid about where they're going and how mycelium they think, will be the kind of the generation that lasts in terms of the alternative proteins.
The nice thing about like the Beyonds and the Impossibles, they became household names.
Absolutely.
And for the first time in the history of vegan food.
Yeah, totally.
Like, it's a big deal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I will say too, I know Ethan Brown, very well. I've met Pat Brown from Impossible a few times soon. I actually just met the new CEO who came in to replace him 2 months ago. But I spent some time with Ethan in March in LA at his headquarters, and he is trying extremely hard. And they have a bunch of new products coming out that are really trying to attack and kind of address all of these kind of healthy claims and ultra processed claims that people have been rightfully putting out about their products. A lot more things coming from like, Whole Foods, legumes that we'll see.
Avocado oil. Yeah.
But I think, it's unfortunately with Beyond, particularly in their business, the financials right now are really kind of dire. Particularly, not only are sales decreasing and profits are decreasing, but they also have this like massive debt bill that's coming due very soon. And, kind of without a sort of kind of white knight, dark savior type of deal, I'm not sure they're really going to be able to survive much longer.
Plant-based meat was having a day, and then the day ended, right?
The day ended.
What brought the rain?
So when there was the meat packing shortages,
yes,
that's when that grew 300%. That's the exact same time frame, which I think is fascinating, right? They capitalized on that, and kudos to them.
Yeah.
But that's when then it started not to last, is into 21, into 22, when at the same time as people weren't repeating it for Beyond, right? Then you also had then the hundreds of other competitors coming in that are almost like a near identical product or very close, right? Very similar, kind of copycats almost.
Yeah.
All coming in, breaking up the consumer further, confusing them further.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it hurt more than helped.
To have so many different.
Yeah. And at the same time, then funding dried up, right? And they had raised at these crazy valuation multiples that then became completely unfeasible. And so then, some of the other smaller startups, right, started taking down rounds, starting to have to, go back and drop their valuations down. And, if you follow the VC world at all, that's kind of like the kiss of death, and the spiral starts from there. And unfortunately, that happened kind of, with dozens of these copycat startups, not just one or two. And so not only has Beyond's like $9 billion valuation dropped down to, a fraction of that, but you've also then had all these other bankruptcies, and I will say too, not only have you had bankruptcies in the alternative proteins, you also had the bankruptcy of Smallhold, the mushroom grower, which I wrote about in the book. Yeah. And that was a devastating one for me to see, just because as someone who was pushing for more whole foods and cleaner ingredients and just, kind of more mushrooms out there.
I do think mushrooms might save us. I do.
I mean, sure, but I'll tell you another time about all the stuff I hear about the
dark side of mushrooms.
Well, there's a whole issue with antifungals and the resistance there.
That's not good.
But it's okay. It's okay. The Last of Us maybe won't happen.
I mean, I guess there's no perfect solution, right? And
mushrooms are close. Mushrooms are the
pretty
closest.
Good, right?
They're pretty much
and they're
the
not
closest.
just good for food; they're good for all sorts of things.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. And anxiety and all of that.
Yeah. Okay, so cultivated meat in the book, because it was 2022. Cultivated meat was not regulated in the USA at the moment. Now, two companies are.
Yes, and I think we've seen this kind of big media frenzy, right? Of now Upside and Eat Just Good Meat, launching for a few weeks, but they're not sold anymore, No. And I think you're seeing that they're not sold anymore because there's just not enough consumer real demand for it at the level they would need for the financials of the business to make sense.
Well, but at the same time, Florida and Alabama have just both banned cultivated meat. What's that?
That was... I mean, I'm not going to stand by anything Ron DeSantis does.
But Alabama did it too, and there's a lot of other states that are lining up to do it.
Yeah, and I think that's anti-competitive. I think the meat industry even says that's anti-competitive. Yeah. And the meat industry has said they don't even want that to happen.
No, they don't, because then you can start banning any food you want. Of course.
And I mean, this is America, for God's sakes, right? I think consumer choice is the name of the game here. That said, I think this should be regulated and have actual specialists looking at really how these all work. Yes, and I think I say that not just because that this is a novel food, but because it's also, I was one of the few people who watched very closely how Impossible went through its FDA regulation, and with, the heme, it's a kind of key ingredient, and just the whole kind of all trial and tribulations there around not actually doing any of the cancer tests or any of the kind of long-term testing that has been deemed possible, but they were still able to kind of get it approved. So I think, as we're just having more and more of these novel foods out there, it's not just up to the businesses. It can't just be an affidavit system like they had done antibiotics stuff for years. It can't.
No, it's got to be a new food system,
Yeah.
right? And all of these all of these guys need to participate in doing things totally differently, not just the actual foods.
Absolutely. There's a lot of different ways to do that. One example I can speak to is I think, we've been talking about government a lot.
Yeah.
I think there needs to be an entirely new way to do food regulation in this country, but that could come through, food as a public utility, food as a universal right. I mean, water, education, healthcare, those are all universal rights. Why do we not think of food as such? Why, as we approach and face climate crisis, why should our state, local governments, not even federal government, but why should we not, be having an actual food utility situation that can be used in crisis? Just essentially like warehousing, right? Of some self-stable stuff, beans, different things that are key for nutrition, especially as we all reel from crisis, may that be just having to be displaced or, actual injuries.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
We'll see.
I hope it comes from like good change, positive change, and not from like destruction. And we have to
Well, I think that's
why
a
big possibility.
We need this to be set up now.
Well, thank you. This was good. This is super insightful. And your book was awesome. I learned so much in this book. I can't even tell you. And I thought I knew a lot about the food system. It's just layered with a history, creepiness, evil. It's really good.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to have done this. This is fun.
Good. Me too. Thank you. To learn more about Chloe and to get her book, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please rate, review, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like to support the podcast, we'd greatly appreciate it. Go to our website, speciesunite.com, and click donate. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knutson, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polke-Link, Sam Kosel, and Anna Kolner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.